Now, as we talk about extending a call, we're actually talking a little bit more about calling today. So last week, if you joined us, we talked about how Joseph took his family to Egypt. We're going to pick up where we left off, but as that family spends time in Egypt, God does some amazing things. The people go through hardship, but God calls Moses to bring them out. He's going to work through his servant Moses. And in this story, we see a God who sees his people and knows his people. This is from Exodus chapters 1 to 4. Let's hear about it in our video for this morning.
God brought Joseph, his brothers, and his father Jacob to Egypt to survive the famine. Years went by, and the family of Israel grew quickly. The land of Egypt was filled with God's people. This made the new king of Egypt nervous. Look, the Israelites are more powerful and more numerous than we are. Let's make sure they know we are in charge so they don't join our enemies. So the Egyptians appointed taskmasters over the family of Israel and made them slaves and forced them to work very hard. But God multiplied the Israelites even more. Then Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, made an evil plan to harm the Israelites even more to keep them from growing stronger. He commanded for all their sons to be put to death. Any son born to the Israelites was to be thrown into the Nile River to drown. A woman named Jochebed hid her baby boy for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she placed him in a basket in the Nile River. The baby's sister, Miriam, watched the basket as it floated at the edge of the river. Pharaoh's daughter found the baby and felt sorry for him, so she decided to raise him as her son. She named the baby Moses. When Moses grew up, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave, so he killed the Egyptian. Then Moses fled into the wilderness and became a shepherd. One day, he saw a bush that was on fire, but was not burning up. When he went closer to see this strange sight, God called out to him from the bush, "Moses, Moses." "Here I am," Moses answered. God told Moses that he had heard his people, the Israelites, crying out because of their suffering. God was coming to rescue them and bring them to a wonderful land flowing with milk and honey. God said, "I am sending you to Pharaoh to lead my people out of Egypt." Moses did not think he was the right person for this job. He asked, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" God told Moses that he, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, would be with him and would help him. God would perform miracles so that Pharaoh would let the people go. To show Moses his power, God told Moses to throw his staff on the ground. When the staff hit the ground, it became a snake. God told Moses to pick it back up by the tail, and when he did, it became a staff again. God told Moses to take the staff and his brother Aaron and return to Egypt. God saw his people suffering as slaves in Egypt and sent Moses to rescue them. We all suffer as slaves to sin, and God sent Jesus to rescue us by dying and rising again.
So have you ever felt underqualified for a job that you ended up in? Maybe you can think about that as like a career thing. You felt underqualified for the job. Or sometimes I think we feel underqualified for the relationships God calls us into. Maybe we feel underqualified for that familial relationship where we kind of have that tension, or we feel underqualified for talking to a classmate. For me, I think one of the times I think of the most underqualified I felt was probably in the hospital room with the firstborn child. Right? There's so much excitement in that day on the birth of your firstborn child, and you realize you have the most precious thing that God has ever put in your hands. And when, as a father, they come to ask you if you want to hold the baby, of course you want to hold the baby. It's your baby. And then you reach out and take it, and all of the training starts to come back into your head. Okay, we got to support the neck. We got to be really gentle with it. And you just kind of like cradle it close to you, and you do it as awkwardly as possible and kind of get it up there and realize God has entrusted me to raise this child to be 18 years old and alive. And that's scary. And that can be one of those circumstances where it feels like maybe I'm underqualified for this position. If there's ever been that time in life where you're wondering or asking, how do I know I can do it? That's the question that this passage is about. Moses is asking the question, how do I know I can do it? Because God has called him to do some tough things. And at the beginning, God just kind of lays it out. He says, this is what I want you to do, Moses. I want you to rescue my people out from under slavery in Egypt. And Moses is asking that question, how do I know I can do it? And so as we ask that question, where do we look? Where does Moses look? The first place he looks is inside of himself. I think because this is kind of the classic hero story. Where do you find the ability to do this? You look inside of yourself. It's when Simba's looking at his reflection that he has this revelation, right? That this is where I'm going to figure out how qualified I am for the calling God gives me. Who am I? But the problem for Moses, and the problem maybe if you've had that experience before, you look inside of yourself, is you might ask the question, who am I? And there might be qualifications you have that you miss when you look inside of yourself, or you might look inside of yourself and say, I don't know that there's really anything that qualifies me to hold this position. And that's where Moses was. Now, God could have listed his qualifications. God could have talked about how through Moses' entire life he's been preparing him for this moment. But instead, God tells him not to look deeper inside of himself, but to find his calling. God tells him to look outside of himself. This is God's response. He says, but I will be with you. You see, it's not about you. It's not about what you are capable of to see what God can do through you in your life. It's not about who you are to fulfill that calling. It's about who God is. And that's God's promise to Moses is, I will be with you. And the conversation goes on. Moses has so many questions. He asks, well, then who are you? And God tells him who he is. He is the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac. He is the God who has been and the God who will be. He is the God who is faithful, who sees his people and who knows them. You see, when we ask that question, how do I know I can do it? It's not about me doing it. It's about God doing it. And God gives him the confidence he's going to be with him. So Moses has this. He knows, okay, so I'm going to go back to these people. God is going to be with me. I know who I'm going to tell them God is. But there's this one other problem that Moses comes up with, is that if I go with all of God's authority and I know that he's with me and I go to this difficult calling, the people, what if they don't believe me? You see, I believe in God, but what if everybody else doesn't believe what I believe? And I think maybe we ask that same question of ourselves when we think about the callings God puts in our lives. When we think about kids, maybe the calling is that classmate who doesn't have a church home, to invite them to church. Well, what if they don't believe me? Or maybe that discussion you have with a family member or a neighbor or a coworker. But what if they don't believe me? Am I equipped enough? Do I have all of the tools to make them believe? How am I going to figure this out? And the way that God answers this question is kind of similar. He tells Moses that it's not really his responsibility to make them believe. Instead, the way God works with Moses is he gives him a sign. He says, I'm going to do something special. I'm going to turn that staff in your hand into a snake. And that sign will show the people of Israel that they need to believe in Moses. Now for us, it's also not our job to make everyone believe. It's our job to tell people the truth with confidence. And as we tell people the truth with confidence, we can point to the signs. We can point to the sign of our lives that we wouldn't be here if there wasn't a real Jesus who had really risen from the dead and who is really in charge. We can point back in history to the signs that if you look at the historical events around Jesus' resurrection, the only thing that makes sense is that Jesus really died and he really is alive. We could point back to the signs, but in all of these things, when we look at our calling and ask the question, how do I know I can do it? How do I know I can share this testimony? How do I know I can really share the faith? Well, it's not my job to make people believe. It's God's job. And so I can faithfully share the testimony. I can look for the signs and I can point people towards them, but ultimately I'm trusting in the God who is with me. And this is where the story kind of gets funny, because Moses just comes up with every excuse that he can. And in the next couple of verses, that's what he's going to do. But what God reminds him of every single time, God's answer is always the same. It's always to remind Moses, when you're trying to figure out how do I know I can do it, it's not about you, it's about me. He reminds him of who he is. And if you get a chance this week to read through Exodus chapters 3 and 4, do it and see how many times God says, I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob, which all points us back to the verses that happened right before this text. And this is really what I want to focus in on today from Exodus chapter 2, is that God heard the cry of his people, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and with Jacob, and God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. Because there are times in our lives where we say, this is more than I can handle. There are times in our lives where we say, God, why would you have given me this job? There are times in our lives where we feel underqualified. But in those times, remember that God sees you, and he sees his people, and he knows you, and he knows his people with way more depth than you know yourself. And this God who sees you and knows you, he sees and knows everything you've done. He sees and knows everything he's done in your life. He sees and knows all of your preparedness and unpreparedness. And he loves you and calls you. And we have proof of God's love in the cross, that he would love us enough to give up his son. And we have proof of his calling just by looking around and seeing that God has placed you in this position in life. And the chair you're sitting in is only your chair. I'm talking, that's metaphorically. Maybe you have a child on your lap, but metaphorically, the chair you're sitting in is only your chair, because only you are living in the position you're in, and God has called you into that position, the God who sees you, the God who knows you, and the God who loves you more than we can even imagine. It was true for Moses, and no matter what excuse he would come up with, God saw and God knew better than him, and God sees and knows better than you, and he loves you more deeply than you could ever know.